Will. This is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 1, The Old Sea Dog at the Admiral Benbow. Now, we're telling a pirate story, so naturally, we need to dress the part with a mid-80s yacht hat. The Old Sea Dog at the Admiral Benbow. Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of the gentlemen having asked me to write down the whole particulars about the Treasure Island, from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearings of the island, and that only because there's still treasure not yet lifted, I take up my pen at the year of grace 17. Go back to a time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with the saber cut first took up his lodging under our roof. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand barrow, a tall, strong, heavy, nut-brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over his shoulders, and his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred with black, brown nails, and the saber cut across one cheek in a dirty, livid white. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song he often sang afterwards. 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. In the high, old, tottering voice that seemed to have been tuned and broken to the capstan bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of a stick, like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. Then it was brought to him, and he drank slowly, like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," he said at length, "and a pleasant situated grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company, but more was the pity. "Well, then," he said, "this is the berth for me. Here, ye matey," he cried to the man who trundled the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up me chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want. And that head up there for a watch ship's off. What might you call me? You might call me Captain. Oh, I see you're at there." And he threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," he said, looking as fierce as a commander. And indeed, as bad as his clothes were, and coarsely as he spoke, he had none of the appearance of a man who sailed before the mast, but seemed like a mate or skipper accustomed to be obeyed or to strike. The man who came with the barrow told us the mail had set him down. Let's start that paragraph over. The man who came with the barrow told us the mail had set him down the morning before at the Royal George, that had inquired what inns there were along the coast, and hearing ours well spoken of, I suppose, and described as lonely, had it chosen from the others for his place of residence. And that was all we could learn of our guest. He was a very tall, silent man by custom. All day he hung round the cove, or upon the cliffs with a brass telescope. All evening he sat in the corner of the parlor next to the fire, and drank rum and water very strong. Mostly he would not speak when spoken to, only look up sudden and fierce, or blow through his nose like a foghorn. And we, the people who came about our house, soon learnt to let him be. Every day when he came back from his stroll, he would ask as any seafaring man had gone by along the road. At first we thought it was the want of company of his own kind that made him ask this question, but at last we began to see he was desirous to avoid them. When a seaman put up at the Admiral Benbow, as now and then some did, making by the coast road for Bristol, he would look in them through the curtained door before he entered the parlor, and he was always sure to be as silent as a mouse when any such was present. For me, at least, there was no secret about the matter, for I was in a way a sharer in his alarms. He had taken me aside one day and promised me a silver fourpenny, the first of every month, if I would only keep my weather eye open for a seafaring man with one leg, and let him know the moment he appeared. Often enough, when the first of the month came around, I applied to him for my wage. He would only blow through his nose at me and stare me down. But before the week was out, he was sure to think better of it and bring me my fourpenny price, and repeat his orders to look for a seafaring man with one leg. How that personage haunted my dreams, I need secretly tell you. On stormy nights when the wind shook the 4 corners of the house and the surf roared along the cove and up the cliffs, I would see him in 1,000 forms and with 1,000 diabolical expressions. Now the leg would be cut off at the knee, now at the hip, and he was a monstrous kind of creature who had never had but one leg. and in the middle of his body. To see him leap and run and pursue me over the hedge and ditch was the worst of my nightmares, and altogether I paid pretty dear for my monthly fourpenny piece in the shape of those abominable fancies. But though I was so terrified by the idea of the seafaring man with one leg, I was far less afraid of the captain himself than anybody else who knew him. There were nights when he took a deal more rum and water than his head would carry. He would sometimes sit and sing in his wicked old wild sea songs, minding nobody, but sometimes he would call for glasses round and force all the trembling company to listen to his stories and force all the chorus to his singing. Often I've heard the house shaking with "Yo ho ho" and a bottle of rum, and all the neighbors joining in for dear life with the fear of death upon them, and each singing louder than the other to avoid remark. For in these fits he was the most overriding companion ever known. He would slap his hand on the table for silence all around. He would fly up in a passion of anger at question, or sometimes because none was put, and so he judged the company not following his story. Nor would he allow anyone to leave the inn until he had drunk himself sleepy and reeled off to bed. His stories were what frightened people worst of all. Dreadful stories they were, about hanging and walking the plank, in storms at sea, in the dry Tortugas, and the wild deeds and places of the Spanish Main. By his own account, he must have lived his life over the wickedest men God could ever allow upon the sea, and the language in which he told these stories shocked our most plain country people almost as much as the crimes he described. My father was always saying the end would be ruined, for people would soon cease coming there to be tyrannized over and put down, then sent shivering to their beds. But I really believe his presence did us good. People were frightened at the time, but on looking back, they rather liked it. It was a fine excitement in a quiet country life, and there was even a party of the younger men who pretended to admire him, calling him a true sea dog and a real old salt, and such like names, and saying was the sort of that man that made England terrible at sea. In one way, indeed, he bade fair to ruin us, for he kept on staying week after week and last month after month, and that all the money he had long exhausted, and my father never picked up the heart to insist on having him pay more. If he ever mentioned it, the captain blew his nose so loudly you might say he roared, and stared my poor father straight out of the room. I've seen him wringing his hands after such a rebuff, and I'm sure the annoyance and terror he lived in must have greatly hastened his early and unhappy death. All the time he lived with us, the captain made no change whatsoever in his dress, but to buy some stockings from a hawker. So at least the guy changed his underwear once in a while, right? Wash your hands, change your underwear. One of the cocks of his hat having fallen down, he let it hang from that day forth. How about that? Does that look good? No, it never looks good. He let it hang from that day forth, thought it was a great annoyance when it blew. I remember the appearance of his coat, which patched himself upstairs in his room, and which before the end was nothing but patches. He never wrote or received a letter, and he never spoke with any but the neighbors, and with these, for the most part, only when drunk on rum. The great sea chest, which none of us had ever seen, was never opened. He was only ever once crossed, and that was towards the end, when my poor father was far gone in decline, and that took him off. Dr. Livesey came through one afternoon to see the patient, took a bit of dinner from my mother, and went into the parlor to smoke a pipe until his horse should come down from the hamlet, for we had no stabling on the old Benbow. I followed him in, and I remember observing the contrast. The neat, bright doctor with his powder as white as snow, powdered wig, as bright as snow, and his bright black eyes and pleasant manners made with the cultish country folk, and above all, with that filthy, heavy-bleared scarecrow of a pirate of ours, sitting far gone of rum, with his arms on the table. Suddenly he, the captain, began to pipe up with his eternal song, 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum, drinking the devil had done for the rest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. At first I had supposed the dead man's chest to be that identical big box of his upstairs in the front room, and that thought had been mingled in my nightmares with that of the one-legged seafaring man. But this time we had all long ceased to pay any particular notice to the song. It was new that night to nobody but Dr. Livesey, and on him I observed it did not produce an agreeable effect, for he looked up for a moment quite angrily before he went on to his talk at old Taylor, the gardener, a new cure for the rheumatics. In the meantime, the captain gradually brightened up at his own music, and last flapped his hand upon the table before him in a way we all knew to mean silence. The voices stopped at once, all but Dr. Livesey's. He went on as before, speaking a word or two. The captain glared at him for a while, flapped his hand again, glared still harder, and last broke out with a villainous oath. "Silence there between decks!" "Were you addressing me, sir?" says the doctor. And when the ruffian had told him, with another oath, replies, "I have only one thing to say to you, sir, that if you keep on drinking rum, this world will soon be quite quit of a very dirty scoundrel." The old fellow's fury was awful. He sprang to his feet, drew and opened a sailor's clasp knife, a sailor's lightsaber, and bouncing it open on the palm of his hand, threatened to pin the doctor to the wall. The doctor never so much as moved. He spoke to him as before over the shoulder, and in the same tone of voice, rather high, so the whole room might hear, "If you do not put that knife this instant in your pocket, I promise upon my honor you shall hang at the next assizes." Now, that's an old word that even I don't understand, so let's just say we're going to hang at the next opportunity. Boom. Then followed a battle of looks between them, but the captain soon knuckled under, put his weapon, resumed his seat, grumbling like an beaten dog. "And now, sir," continued the doctor, "since I now know there's such a fellow in my district, you may count I'll have an eye upon you day and night. I'm not a doctor only, I'm a magistrate. And if I catch a breath of complaint against you, if it's only for a piece of incivility like tonight, it'll take effectual means to have you hunted down and routed out of this. Like that suffice." Soon after, Dr. Livesey's horse came to the door, and he rode away. But the captain held his peace that evening, and for many evenings to come. Chapter 2. Let's keep going. Chapter 2. Black Dog appears and disappears. It was not very long after this that there occurred the first of the mysterious events that rid us last of the captain, though not, as you will see, of his affairs. It was bitter cold winter, with long, hard frost and heavy gales, and it was plain at first for my poor father was likely to not see the spring. He got worse every day, and my mother and I had all the inn to handle, and we were kept busy enough without paying much regard to our unpleasant guest. It was one January morning, very early, a pinching, frosty morning, the cove all gray with hoarfrost, the ripple lapping softly on the stones, the sun still low and only touching the hilltops and shining far to seaward. The captain had risen earlier than usual and set out down the beach, his cutlass swinging around under his hat tilted back ahead. I remember his breath hanging like smoke in the wake as he strode off, and the last sound I heard of him, as he turned the big rock, was a snort of indignation, as though his mind was still running upon Dr. Livesey. Well, Mother was upstairs with Father, and I was laying upon the breakfast table against the captain's turn, when the parlor door opened, and a man stepped in, whom I never set my eyes on before. He was a pale, tallowy creature, wanting 2 fingers of the left hand, and though he wore a cutlass, he did not much look like a fighter. I always had my eye open for a seafaring man with 1 leg or 2. And I remember this one puzzled me. He was not sailorly, and yet he had the smack of the sea about him, too. I asked for him, "What is his service?" And he said for he would take rum. But as I was going out of the room to fetch it, he sat down upon a table and motioned me to draw near. I paused with my napkin in hand. "Come here, sonny, come nearer here." I took a step nearer. "Is this here table for me mate Bill?" he asked with a kind of leer. I told him I did not know this mate Bill, and for this is a person who stayed in our house, whom we called the captain. "Well, my mate Bill would be called the captain, as like as not. He has a cut on one cheek, and a mighty pleasant way with him, particularly in drink, has my mate Bill. We'll put it, for argument like, that your captain has a cut on one cheek, and we'll put it, if you like, that that cheek's on the right one." "Ah, well, I told you, now my mate Bill is in this here house." I told him he was out walking. "Which way, sonny, which way has he gone?" And when I had pointed out the rock and told him how the captain was likely to return and how soon, I answered a few more questions for him. "Ah, this'll be as good as drink, as drink to me, mate Bill." The expression on his face said these words was not at all pleasant, and I had my own reasons for thinking that the stranger was mistaken, even supposing he meant what he said. But it was no affair of mine, I thought, and besides, it was difficult to know what to do. The stranger kept hanging about just inside the inn door, peering around the corner like a cat waiting for a mouse. Once I stepped out myself into the road, But he immediately called me back, and as I did not obey quick enough for his fancy, a most horrible change came about his tallowy face. And he ordered me in with an oath that made me jump, and as soon as I came back, he returned on his former manner, half fawning, half sneering, patted me on the shoulder, told me I was a good boy, and told me he'd taken quite a fancy to me. "I have a son of my own," said he, "as like you as two blocks, and he's all the pride of my heart. But the great thing for boys is discipline, sonny, discipline. Now, if you had sailed along of Bill, you wouldn't have stood there to be stoked to twice, not you. That was never Bill's way, not the way sich I sailed with him. And since here, sure enough, is me mate Bill, with the spyglass under his arm, bless his old heart, to be sure. You and me'll just go back into the parlor, sonny, and get behind the door, and we'll give Bill a little surprise, bless his heart, I say again." So saying, the stranger backed along with me into the parlor, and we put behind him in the corner, so that we were both hidden by the open door. I was very uneasy and alarmed, as you might fancy, and it rather added to my fears to observe the stranger was certainly frightened himself. He cleared the hilt of his cutlass and loosened the blade in the sheath. And all the time we were waiting as he kept swallowing as if he feared we used to call a lump in his throat. At last in strode the captain, slammed the door behind him. Without looking right or left, marched straight across the room where his breakfast awaited him. "Bill!" said the stranger in a voice that I thought had tried to make bold and big. The captain spun round on his heel and fronted us. The brown had gone out of his face, and even worse, his nose was blue. He had the look of a man who had seen a ghost, or the evil one, or something worse, if anything can be. And upon my word, I felt sorry to see him all in a moment, so old and so sick. "Come, Bill, you know me. You know an old shipmate, Bill." "Surely," said the captain. The captain made sort of a grasp. "Black dog," said he. "And who else?" returned the other, getting a little more at ease. "Black dog as ever was, come for his old shipmate Billy at the Admiral Benbow Inn. Ah, Bill, Bill, we have seen a sight of times, us two, since I lost between them two talons," as he held up his mutilated hand. Now look here," said the captain. "You've run me down. Here I am. Well, speak up. What is it?" "That's you, Bill. You're in the right of it, Billy. I'll have a glass of rum for this dear child here, as I've took such a liking to, and we'll sit down, if you please, and talk square like old shipmates." I returned with the rum. They were already seated on either side of the captain's breakfast table, Black Dog next to the door, and sitting sideways so as to have one eye on his old shipmate and one, as I thought, on his retreat. He bade me go, and leave the door wide open. "None of your keyholes for me, sonny," he said, and I left them together and returned into the bar. For a long time, though, I certainly did my best to listen. I could hear nothing but a low gabbing. But as the voices began to grow higher, and I could pick up a word or two, mostly oaths from the captain. "No, no, no, an end of it," he cried once again. "And if it comes to swinging, swing all, say I." Then all of a sudden there was a tremendous explosion of oaths and other noises. The chair and the table went over in a lump. A clash of steel followed. A clash of lightsaber followed, and then a cry of pain. And the next instant, I saw Black Dog in full flight, Captain hotly pursuing, both with drawn cutlasses. "Yah!" And the former screaming blood from the left shoulder. Blah! Just at the door, the captain aimed at the fugitive captain one last tremendous cut, which would certainly have split him right down the middle had it not been intercepted by an old signboard. Our inn sign stopped the blow. I tried to stab you, but the sign stopped it. What kind of accuracy does he have if he's swinging at a guy and he hits the sign at the bar? "That be rum, matey." Back to the story. That blow is the last of the battle. Once out upon the road, Black Dog, in spite of his wound, showed a wonderful clean pair of heels and disappeared over the edge of the hill in half a minute. The captain, for his part, stood staring at the signboard like a bewildered man. Then he passed his hand over his eyes several times, and at last turned back into the house. "Jim, rum." As he spoke, he reeled a little and caught himself with one hand against the wall. "Are you hurt?" I asked him. "Rum. I must get away from here. Rum! Rum! I ran to fetch it, but I was quite unsteadied by all that had fallen out, and I broke one glass and fouled at the tap. And while I was still getting in my own way, I heard a loud fall in the parlor, running behind the captain, lying full length on the floor. In some instant, my mother, alarmed by the cries and the fighting, came running downstairs to help me. Between us, raised his head. He was breathing very loud, very hard. His eyes were closed, but he was alive. "Dear, dearie me!" cried my mother. "What a disgrace upon the house! And your poor father sick!" That's Jim's mom. By the way, do you think Jim's mom has got it going on? In the meantime, we had no idea what to do to help the captain, nor any other thought but that he had got his death hurt in the scuffle with this stranger. I got the rum, to be sure, and he tried to put it down his throat, but his teeth were tightly shut and his jaw strong as iron. It was a happy relief for us when the door opened and Dr. Livesey came in on his visit for my father. "Oh, doctor!" we cried. "What shall we do? Where is he wounded?" "Wounded? A fiddlestick's end," said the doctor. "No more wounded than you or I. The man has had a stroke, as I warned you. Now, Mrs. Hawkins, just you run upstairs to your husband, and I tell him, if possible, nothing about it. For my part, I must do my best to save this fellow's trebly worthless life. And Jim, you get me a basin." When I got back with the basin, the doctor had already ripped up the captain's sleeve and exposed his great sinewy arm. It was tattooed in several places. "Here's luck, a fair wind," and "Billy Bones his fancy" were very neatly and clearly executed on the forearm. And up near the shoulder there was a sketch of gallows and a man hanging from it, as done, I thought, with great spirit. "Prophetic," said the doctor, touching this picture with a finger. "And now, Master Billy Bones, if that be your name, we'll have a look at the colour of your blood." And I don't know if you could hear it. I pronounced the U in color, like the way the British spell it, to be very proper. "Colour of your blood, Jim. Are you afraid of blood?" "No, sir," said I. "Well, then, you hold the basin." And with that, he took his lancet and opened a vein. A great deal of blood was taken out before the captain opened his eyes and looked mistily about him. First, he recognized the doctor with an unmistakable frown. Then his glance fell upon me, and he looked relieved. But suddenly his color changed, and he tried to raise himself. "Where's Black Dog?" "There is no black dog here," said the doctor, "except what you have on your own back. You have been drinking rum. You had a stroke, precisely as I told you, and I have just very much against my own will dragged you at the foremost out of the grave." "Now, Mr. Bones—" "That's not my name," he interrupted. "Much I care," returned the doctor. "It's the name of a buccaneer and of my acquaintance, and I call you by it for the sake of shortness. And what I have to say to you is this: one glass of rum won't kill you, but if you take one, you'll take another and another, and I stake my wig, if you don't break off short, you'll die. Do you understand that? Die, and go to your own place, like the man in the Bible. Now come, make an effort. I'll help you to your bed for once." Between us, with much trouble, we managed to hoist him upstairs and laid him on his bed, where his head fell back on the pillow as if he were almost fainting. "Now, mind you," said the doctor, "I clear my conscience, and the name of rum for you is death." And with that he went off to see my father, taking me with him by the arm. "This is nothing," he said, as soon as he closed the door. "I have drawn blood enough to keep him quite a while. He should lie for a week where he is. That's the best thing for him and for you. Another stroke would settle him." Before we start chapter 3, I think this is a great opportunity to just hit the pause button, get up, walk around, get some blood flowing, remember to wash your hands, and we'll be right back, and we're going to start chapter 3. Hey, welcome back. We're about to get into chapter 3. So hopefully you had a good chance to get up, take a quick little break, and remember, wash your hands, don't touch your face, cough into your elbow. Here's a little fun thing: does everybody remember the pirate song that old Billy Bones was singing? It's a good one to wash your hands to if you sing it twice in a row. 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. Blah 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 blah. I already forget what the lyrics were. Just wash your hands. All right, here we go. Let's get into it. Chapter 3, The Black Spot. About noon, I stopped at the captain's door with some cooling drinks and medicines. He was laying very much as we had left him, only a little higher, and seemed both weak and excited.
Jim, he said, you're the only one here that's worth anything, and you know I've always been good to you. Never a month, but I've given you a silver fourpenny for yourself. And now you see, mate, I'm pretty low, and deserted by all. And Jim, you'll bring me a noggin of rum now, won't you, matey?
The doctor, I began, but he broke in, cursing the doctor in a feeble voice, but heartily.
The doctor's all swabs, and that doctor there, why, do he know about seafaring men? I've been in places hot as pitch, and mates dropping round with yellow jack.
Malaria. Don't get malaria.
And the blessed land a heaving the sea with earthquakes. What does the doctor know of lands like that? And I lived on rum, I tell ya. It's been meat and drink and man and wife to me. And I'm not one to have me rum now. I'm a poor old hulk on a lee shore. My blood'll be on ya, Jim, like a doctor's swab. Look, Jim, look how me fingers fidges, he said in a pleading tone. I can't keep him still, not I. I haven't had a drop but this blessed day. The doctor's a fool, I tell you. If I don't have a drain of rum, Jim, I'll have the horrors. I've seen 'em already. I seen old Flint in the corner there behind you. As plain as print, I seen him. And if I get the horrors, I'm a man who has lived rough. And I'll raise Cain. Your doctor herself said one glass wouldn't hurt me. I'll give you a golden guinea for a noggin, Jim.
He was growing more and more excited, and this alarmed me for my father, who was very low that day and needed to be quiet. Besides, I was reassured by the doctor's words, and now quoted to me, and rather offered by, offended by the offer of a bribe. I want none of your money, said I, but what you owe my father. Let's strike that. All I want is what you owe my father. I'll get you one glass and nothing else. When I brought it to him, he seized it greedily and drank it out.
Aye, aye, said he, that's some better, sure enough. And now, matey, did that doctor say how long I was to lie here in this old berth?
A week at least.
Thunder! He cried. A week! I can't do that. They'd have the black spot on me by then. The lubbers is going about to get the way of me this blessed moment. The lubbers as couldn't keep me what behavior now. What I want to know. They couldn't keep what they got, and they want to nail with us and others. But I'm a saving soul. I never wasted good money of mine, nor lost it neither, and I'll trick 'em again. I'm not afraid of them. I'll shake out of another reef, matey, and I'll daddle 'em again.
As he was thus speaking, he had risen from bed with great difficulty, holding onto my shoulder with a grip that almost made me cry out, and moving his legs like so much dead weight. His words, spirited as they were in meaning, contrasted sadly with the weakness of voice in which they were uttered. He paused when he had gotten into a sitting position on the edge.
The doctor has done me, he murmured. My ear is singing. Lay me back.
Before I could do much to help him, he had fallen back again to his former place, and he lay for a while silent.
Jim, you saw that seafaring man today?
Black Dog? I asked.
Ah, Black Dog, he said. He's a bad un. But there's worse than put him on. Now, if I can't get away nohow, and they tip me to the black spot, mind ya, it's my old sea chest they're after. You get on a horse, you can, can't you? Well, then you get on a horse, and go to, well, yes, I will, to that eternal Dr. Swab, and tell him to pipe all hands, magistrates and such, and he'll lay 'em aboard the Admiral Benbow. All old Flint's crew, man and boy, all on 'em that's left. I was first mate, I was. Old Flint's first mate. And I'm the only one knows the place. He gave it to me at Savannah when he was lay a dying, like I was to now, you see. But you won't peach again to the black spot on me, unless you see that Black Dog again, or a seafaring man with one leg, Jim. Him above all.
But what is the black spot, Captain?
That's a summons, mate, I'll tell you, if they get that. But you keep your weather eye open, Jim, and I'll share your equals, upon me honor.
He wandered a little longer, his voice growing weaker. But soon after I had given him his medicine, which he took like a child, with the remark,
If ever a seaman wanted drugs, it's me.
Look out, Nancy Reagan, he fell at last into a heavy, swoon-like sleep, in which I left him. What I should have done, had all gone well, I do not know. Probably I should have told him the whole story to the Probably I should have told the whole story to the doctor, for I was in mortal fear lest the captain should repent of his confessions and make an end of me. But as things fell out, my poor father died quite suddenly that evening, which put all other matters on one side. Our natural distress, the visits of the neighbors, the arranging of the funeral, and all the work of the inn to be carried on in the meanwhile kept me so busy that I had scarcely time to think of the captain, far less be afraid of him. He got downstairs next morning, to be sure, and had his meals as usual, though he ate little, and had more, I'm afraid, than his usual supply of rum, for he helped himself out of the bar, scowling and blowing through his nose, and no one dared to cross him. On the night before the funeral, he was as drunk as ever, and it was shocking in that house of mourning to hear him singing away at his old sea song. But weak as he was, we were all in the fear of death for him, and the doctor was suddenly taken up with the case many miles away. It was never near the house after my father's death. I've said the captain was weak, and indeed he seemed to grow rather weaker than regain his strength. He clambered up and downstairs, and went from the parlor to the bar and back again, and sometimes put his nose out of the doors to smell the sea, holding on to the walls as he went for support, and breathing hard and fast like a man on a steep mountain. He never particularly addressed me, and it is my belief that as good as forgotten his confidences, but his temper was more flighty, and allowing for his bodily weakness, and more violent than ever. He had an alarming way now, when he was drunk, of drawing his cutlass and laying it bare before him on the table. But with all that, oh, you can cut that off. Cool. Okay, so he laid it bare on the table. But with all that, he minded people less, and seemed shut up in his own thoughts, rather wandering. Once, for instance, to our extreme wonder, he piped up to a different air, a kind of country love song that he must have learned in his youth before he began to follow the sea. So things passed until the day after the funeral, and about 3 o'clock, a bitter, foggy, frosty afternoon, and I was standing at the door for a moment, full of sad thoughts about my father, when I saw someone drawing slowly near along the road. He was plainly blind, for he tapped before him with the stick, and wore a green shade over his eyes and nose, and he was hunched, as if with age or weakness, and wore a large, old, tattered sea cloak. Let's find a large, old, tattered sea cloak. Wore a large, old, tattered sea cloak with a hood that made him appear positively deformed. I never saw in my life a more dreadful looking figure. He stopped a little from the inn, and raising his voice in an odd sing-song, addressed the air in front of him. Will any kind friend inform a poor blind man who has lost the precious sight of his eyes in the gracious defence of his native country, England? And God bless King George! Where, or in what part of the country, he may now be? You're at the Admiral Benbow, dude. Black Hill Cove, my good man, said I. I hear a voice, said he. A young voice. Will you give me your hand, my kind friend, and lead me in? I held out my hand, and the horrible, soft-spoken, eyeless creature gripped it in a moment like a vice. I was so much startled that I struggled to withdraw, but the blind man pulled me close up to him with a single, "No, boy," he said. "Take me in to the captain." "Sir," said I, "upon my word I dare not." "Ho!" he sneered. "That's it. Take me in straight, or I'll break your arm." And he gave it as he spoke a wrench that made me cry out, "Sir! It's for yourself, I mean. The captain is not what he used to be. He sits with a drawn cutlass. Another gentleman—" "Come now, march!" he interrupted, and I never heard a voice so cruel and cold and ugly as that blind man's. It cowed me more than the pain, and I began to obey him at once, walking straight in the door and towards the parlor where our sick old buccaneer was sitting, dazed with rum. The blind man clung close to me, holding me in one iron fist and leaning almost more of his weight on me than I could carry. "Lead me straight up to him, and when I'm in view, cry out, 'Here's a friend for you, Bill.' If you don't, I'll do this." And with that, he gave me a twitch that I thought should have made me faint. Between this and that, I was so utterly terrified of the blind beggar, I forgot my terror of the captain, and as I opened the parlor door, cried out the words he had ordered in a trembling voice, "Here's a friend for you, Bill." The poor captain raised his eyes, and at one look, the rum went out of him and left him staring sober. The expression of his face was not so much of terror as mortal sickness. He made a movement to rise, but I do not believe he had enough force left in his body. "Now, Bill, sit where you are," said the beggar. "If I can't see, I can hear a finger stirring. Business is business. Hold out your left hand. Boy, take his left hand by the wrist and bring it near my right." We both obeyed him to the letter, and I saw him pass something from the hollow of the hand that held his stick into the palm of the captain's, which closed upon it instantly. "And now that's done," said the blind man at the words. He suddenly left hold of me, and with incredible accuracy and nimbleness skipped out of the parlor and into the road, where, as I stood motionless, I could hear his stick go tip tap 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 into the distance, and vroom 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 like a lightsaber. It was some time before either I or the captain seemed to gather our senses, but at length, about at the same moment, I released his wrist, which I was still holding, and he drew in his hand and looked sharply into the palm. "10 o'clock!" he cried. "6 hours! We'll do them yet!" And he sprung to his feet. Even as he did so, he reeled. He put his hand to his throat, stood swaying for a moment, and then, with a peculiar sound, his whole height face foremost to the floor. I ran to him at once, calling to my mother, but haste was all in vain. The captain had been struck dead by the thunder and apoplexy. It's a curious thing to understand, for I had certainly never liked the man, but of late I'd begun to pity him. And as soon as I saw that he was dead, I burst into a flood of tears. It was the second death I had known, and the sorrow of the first was still fresh in my heart. When I just realized, ah! It's the black spot! It's the black spot! Gotcha. All right. Chapter 4: The Sea Chest. I lost no time, of course, in telling my mother all that I knew, and perhaps should have told her long before. And we saw ourselves at once in a difficult and dangerous position. Some of the man's money, if he had any, was certainly due to us. But it's not likely that our captain shipmates, above all the two specimens seen by me, Black Dog and the blind beggar, would be inclined to give up their booty in payment of the dead man's debts. The captain's order to mount at once and ride for Dr. Livesey would have left my mother alone and unprotected, which was not to be thought of. Indeed, it seemed impossible for either of us to remain much longer in the house. The fall of coals in the kitchen grate, the very ticking of the clock, filled us with alarms. The neighborhood, to our ears, seemed haunted by approaching footsteps, and between the dead body of the captain on the parlor floor and the thought of that desperate blind beggar hovering at hand and ready to return, there were moments when, as the saying goes, I jumped in my skin for the terror. Something must speedily be resolved upon, and it occurred to me at last to go forth together and seek help in the neighboring hamlet. No sooner than done. Bareheaded as we were, we ran out at once, gathering evening and through the frosty fog. The hamlet lay not many hundred yards away. Let's just say house. The house wasn't more than a couple hundred yards away of the view on the other side for the next cove. And what greedily encouraged me. It was in an opposite direction from where hence the blind man had made his appearance and whither he had presumably returned. The new house was in the other direction from where the blind beggar came. We were not many minutes or so on the road, though we sometimes stopped to lay hold of each other and hearken. But there was no unusual sound. Nothing. Nothing but the low wash of the ripple and croaking of the inmates of the wood. Crickets. It was already candlelight when we reached the hamlet and house, and I shall never forget how much I was cheered to see the yellow shine in the doors and windows. But that, as it proved, was the best of help we were likely to get in that quarter, for you would have thought men had been ashamed of themselves. No soul would consent to return with us to the Admiral Benbow. The more we told of our troubles, the more the man, woman, and child, they clung to that shelter of their houses. The name of Captain Flint, though it was strange to me, was well enough known to some there, and carried a great weight of terror. Some of the men who had been to field work on the far side of the Admiral Benbow remembered, besides, to have seen several strangers on the road, and taking them to be smugglers, to have bolted away. And one at least had seen a little lugger in what we called Kit's Hole. For that matter, anyone who was a comrade of the captain's was enough to frighten them to death. And the short and long of the matter was that we could get several who were willing enough to ride to Dr. Livesey's, which lay in another direction. Not one would help us defend the inn. They say cowardice is infectious, but then argument is, on the other hand, a great emboldener. So when each had his say, my mother made them each a speech. She would not, she declared, lose money that belonged to her fatherless boy. If none of the rest of you dare, Jim and I dare. Back we will go, the way we came, and small thanks to you, big, hulking, chicken-hearted men. We'll have that chest open if we die for it. And I'll thank you for that bag, Miss Crossley, to bring back to our lawful money in. Of course, I said I would go with my mother, and of course they all cried out at our foolhardiness. But even then, not a man would go along with us. All they would do is give me a loaded pistol. At least we were attacked, and to promise to have horses ready, saddled, in case we were pursued in our return, while one lad was to ride forward to the doctors in search of armed assistance. My heart was beating finely when we set forth in the cold night upon this dangerous venture. A full moon was beginning to rise and peered greedily through the upper edges of the fog, and this increased our haste, for it was plain, before we came forth again, that all would be as bright as day, and our departure exposed to the eyes of any watchers. We slipped along the hedges, noiseless and swift, nor did we see or hear anything to increase our terrors, till, to our relief, the door of the Admiral Benbow had closed behind us. I slipped the bolt at once, and we stood and panted for a moment in the dark, alone in the house with the dead captain's body. Then my mother got a candle in the bar, and holding each other's hands, we advanced into the parlor. He lay as we left him, on his back with his eyes open and one arm stretched out. "Draw the blind, Jim," said my mother. "They might come and watch outside. And now," said she, when I had done so, "we have to get the key off that. And who's to touch it? I should like to know." She gave kind of a sob as she said the words. I went down on my knees at once. On the floor, close to his hand, there was a little round of paper, blackened on one side. Ah, ah, blackened on one side. I could not doubt that this was the black spot, and taking it up, I found written on the other side, in very good, clear hand, this short message: "You have till 10 tonight." "You had till 10, mother," said I, and just as I said it, our old clock began striking. This sudden noise startled us shockingly, but the news was good, for it was only 6. "Now, Jim, that key." I felt in his pockets, one after another. A few small coins, a thimble, and some thread, some needles, a big pigtail tobacco bitten away at the end, his gully with a crooked handle, a pocket compass, and a tinder box. That's all they contained. I began to despair. "Perhaps it's around his neck," "Perhaps it's round his neck," suggested my mother. Overcoming a strong repugnance, I tore open his shirt, at the neck, and there, sure enough, hanging a bit in a tarry string, which I cut with his own gully, we found the key. At this triumph, we were filled with hope, and hurried upstairs without delay to the little room where he had slept so long, and where his box had stood since the day of his arrival. It was like any other seaman's chest on the outside, the initial B burnt in the top of it with a hot iron, and the corner somewhat smashed and broken as long by rough usage. "Give me the key," said my mother, and though the lock was very stiff, she turned it and threw back. The lid was in a twinkling. The lid was a twinkling, apparently. A strong smell of tobacco and tar rose from the interior, but nothing was to be seen on the top except a suit of very good clothes, carefully brushed and folded. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pause in the middle of this paragraph. My dog Yellow might come make an appearance, and if he does, he's the sweetest dog in the world. He's going to come act out. He's going to be a pirate. He's going to be my second mate. So previously on Treasure Island, they opened the chest. There's a bee. Smells like tobacco. Go. They found some new clothes. They'd never been worn, my mother said. Under that, the miscellany began: a quadrant, a tin cannikin, several sticks of tobacco, 2 brace of very handsome pistols, a piece of bar silver, an old Spanish watch, and some other trinkets of little value, mostly foreign, and a pair of compasses mounted with brass, 5 or 6 curious West Indian shells. I've often wondered why he should have carried about these shells with him in his wandering, guilty and hunted life. In the meantime, we found nothing of any value but the silver and the trinkets, and neither of those were really in our way. Underneath there was an old boat cloak, whitened with sea salt on many a harbor bar. My mother pulled it up with impatience, and there lay before us the last thing in the chest: a bundle tied up in oilcloth. and looking like papers in a canvas bag that gave forth at a touch the jingle of gold. "I'll show these rogues that I'm an honest woman," said my mother. "I'll have my dues and not a farthing over. Hold Mrs. Crossley's bag," and she began to count over the amount of the captain's score from the sailor's bag into the one that I was holding. It was a long, difficult business, for the coins were all countries and sizes, doubloons and louis and guineas and pieces of eight. I don't know what else was in there, all shaken together at random. The guineas, too, were about the scariest, and it was with those that only my mother knew how to make her count. When we were about halfway through, I suddenly put my hand upon her arm, for I had heard in the silent, frosty air a sound that brought my heart into my mouth, the tap tapping of the blind man's stick upon the frozen road. It drew nearer and nearer, while we sat holding our breath. Then it struck sharp at the inn door, and we could hear that handle being turned, and the bolt rattling as the wretched being tried to enter. And then there was a long time of silence, both within and without. Commenced. And to our indescribable joy and gratitude, died slowly away again until it ceased to be heard. "Mother, take the whole thing. Take it all, and let's get out of here." For I was sure the bolted door must have seemed suspicious, and would bring the whole hornet's nest on our ears. Though how thankful I was that I had bolted it, none could tell who had never met that terrible blind man. But my mother, frightened as she was, would not consent to take a fraction more than was due to her. Bless her heart. It was obstinately unwilling to be content with less. It was not yet 7, she said, by a long way, and she knew her rights that she would have them. And she was still arguing with me, when a little low whistle sounded a good way off upon the hill. And more than enough for both of us. "I'll take what I have," she said, jumping to her feet, "and I'll take the square to the count." I'm sorry, strike that. "And I'll take the straight to the count," said I, picking up the oilskin packet. I took it all. Next moment, we were both groping downstairs, leaving the candle by the empty chest. And the next we had opened the door, we were in full retreat. We had not started a moment too soon. That fog was rapidly dispersing, and already the moon shone quite clear on the high ground on either side, and it was only in the exact bottom of the dell around the door that a thin veil still hung unbroken to conceal the first steps of our escape. Far less than halfway to the hamlet, very little beyond the bottom of the hill, we must come forth into the moonlight. Nor was this all, for the sound of several footsteps running came already to our ears, and as we looked back in their direction, a light tossing to and fro and still rapidly advanced, showed that one of the new carriers carried a lantern. "My dear," said my mother, "take the money and run on. I am going to faint." This was certainly the end for both of us, I thought. How I cursed the cowardice of the neighbors! How I blamed my poor mother for her honesty and her greed, for the past foolhardiness and the present weakness! We were just at the little bridge by good fortune, and I helped her, tottering as she was, to the edge of the bank, where sure enough she gave a sigh and fell on my shoulder. I do not know how I found the strength to do it all, and I am afraid it was roughly done, but I managed to drag her down the bank and a little way under the arch. Further, I could not move her, for the bridge was too low to let me do more than crawl below it. So there we had to stay, my mother almost entirely exposed, and both of us within earshot of the end. Wow! So you're Jim. You're just some kid, and your dad's sick. He owns a bar. You get this old sea captain who gets drunk every night. You have the old sea captain starts having bar fights. He gets rambunctious. He starts having these sea buddies pop up and asking for weird favors. And all of a sudden, he's in these shenanigans. And an old guy threatens him, and his mom and his dad dies, and the doctor doesn't like him. Wow! What's going to happen next? I don't know. Thank you so much. That's going to be the end of video 1. Stay tuned. We're going to do the next couple chapters. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you. Arr!